Well, thank you, President Cantonis and Dean Parsenius, for those generous introductions. Yes. It is a personal and professional privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this public lecture, which marks the beginning of a colloquium that will continue tomorrow and Saturday at the Sheraton Commander Hotel in Harvard Square. It's wonderful to see so many friends who have come not only from across New England, but from all across the country, as far away as Texas, Nevada, and California. Greetings also to those who are watching online. We very much appreciate your support. I'm delighted to welcome also our illustrious speakers, some of whom have flown here from Europe in just the past hour and found the strength to be here this evening. We appreciate that greatly. I owe a special debt of gratitude to the students in my seminar on the Mystagogy this semester. Over the last 4 months, they have been excellent conversation partners as we work through this difficult text. Thankful to the Maliotis Center, in particular to Presbytera Chrysula, I think I saw her sitting somewhere here, and to Markella Petitsis for their gracious support and assistance. Most of all, I am grateful to my assistant director, Dr. Tikhon Pino, who has worked extremely hard to make this event possible. St. Maximus the Confessor is widely recognized as one of the greatest theological thinkers, not simply in the entire canon of Greek patristic literature, but in the Christian tradition as a whole. A peripatetic monk and prolific writer, his extraordinary theological vision found expression in an unparalleled synthesis of biblical exegesis, ascetic spirituality, patristic theology, and Greek philosophy, which is as remarkable for its conceptual sophistication as for its complex style of composition. The focus of our colloquium this weekend is St. Maximus' Mystagogy, which is the second oldest commentary on the Divine Liturgy. My remarks this evening consider a central aspect of this work. To introduce my paper, it will be helpful to begin with a few words about what people call liturgical spirituality. Liturgical spirituality is a relatively new category in theology. The phrase made its initial appearance in 1920. The phrase made its initial appearance in 1920, reached a peak in 1995, for a while fell out of fashion, but over the last few years has been making a steady comeback. As we might expect, liturgical spirituality, by definition, focuses on things like church attendance and participation in the sacraments. It encourages the faithful to take an active role in the liturgy by following the prayers, singing the responses, and above all, by partaking in the Eucharist. Participation in the liturgy is presented as the principal element of Christian life, and exponents of liturgical spirituality claim that it is the only spirituality that one needs. Now, there is a problem with this definition because while it rightly emphasizes the importance of our outward behavior at liturgy, it pays almost no attention to our internal disposition, as if our external gestures and activities could be so easily separated from our inner life, or as if simply attending church services made personal prayer and asceticism unnecessary. It seems clear that at least some Christian communities have put all their eggs in a liturgical basket for the simple reason that they have minimized or simply lack the spiritual and ascetic practices that have long been part of the Church's tradition. In the absence of these practices, liturgical spirituality becomes something like a ritual version of sola scriptura, a kind of sola adoratio, and this is a temptation to which Orthodox Christians themselves are not immune. I still have it there. Okay. So, for example, and it gives me no pleasure to share this anecdote with you, I once heard someone argue that St. Mary of Egypt was not saved because of her asceticism, but because she received Holy Communion. Now, implicit in a claim like this is the false assumption that public worship and personal prayer are somehow opposed to each other, or that participation in the Eucharist and asceticism are somehow mutually exclusive. Orthodox Christianity, however, has never understood public and private prayer as an either-or dichotomy, but to the contrary, has consistently seen the two as interdependent. This has been well expressed by the contemporary Athonite abbot Emilianos of Simanopetra, and his words on the subject are worth quoting in full. There are some things that go together. They cannot be separated, like faith and works, since one has no meaning apart from the other. The same is true of prayer, which is linked to something else, namely the liturgy and especially Holy Communion. If there is no worship and no Holy Communion, then there can be no prayer, and any prayer uttered apart from them is false. At the same time, if our worship is divorced from intense inward personal prayer, which cries out to God from our depths, then you can be certain that our worship and our Holy Communion is in vain. It is an attempt to deceive God and ourselves by pretending we love him, when in fact we have no relationship with him whatsoever. One day he will say to us, I do not know you. I cannot say, the quotation continues, I go to church if I do not pray. It is pointless for me to receive Holy Communion if I am not constantly praying. And it is pointless for me to pray if I have no part in the divine liturgy and the worship of the church. It should be clear that the spiritual life and the sacramental life go together. Each presupposes the other, and to have one without the other is to have neither. But when prayer and liturgy are inseparably united, when they work together, God becomes present to me. And as I address myself to him, he rushes toward me. He stretches out toward me. And through prayer, I stretch out toward him until we are completely united. And this is an absolutely wonderful statement of the Church's ideal on this question. But it remains nonetheless undeniable that the tension between liturgy and spirituality is found in virtually every religious tradition that has a system of ritual observances. Public worship and private prayer are, or at least should be, truly complementary, but they can easily become uneasy bedfellows and at times even rivals. The harshest condemnations found in the Gospels are those that Jesus levels against the Pharisees, whom he denounced repeatedly for their adherence to the letter of religious observances while ignoring their inner spirit, something which he found detestable and condemned as hypocrisy. The tension then between liturgy and spirituality is nothing new, though it takes on different forms in every generation. A recent book called Ritual and Its Consequences, an essay on the limits of sincerity, argues that, and I quote, our contemporary period is marked by an overwhelming concern with sincerity and authenticity, which rejects ritual as insincere, contrived, and artificial, a mere performance without belief, an obstacle that prevents us from knowing what we really feel and what we really think. Because, in the words of one sociologist, if you don't choose it, it's not authentic for you. And if it is not authentic, it lacks meaning. Thus, ritual is opposed to sincerity, and sincerity often grows out of a reaction against ritual. This, then, is the problem to which St. Maximus, the Confessor's Mystagogy, offers a solution. The solution, however, is complex, since St. Maximus does not give us a simple answer to the question, what is the Church, or what is the divine liturgy? Instead, he gives us layer upon layer of rich interpretations of the Church, the liturgy, and the symbolism of the church building. The Mystagogy is thus a deep theological contemplation of the liturgy, a contemplation of what we might call the liturgy behind the liturgies, by which I mean the metaphysical work and activity of God that stands behind the liturgy that we have been celebrating for more than 2,000 years. For St. Maximus, the liturgy is truly a cosmic liturgy, which for him In the words of one scholar, is a midpoint around which everything revolves, a center from which, like a single bright point into which one cannot look, everything is explained. And this is because the liturgy is everywhere presupposed as the act that makes the real and universal presence of Christ the midpoint between God and creation, heaven and earth, the church and the world, and between ages past and ages to come. And this is exactly what we expect, since the word mystagogy means initiation into the mysteries, and in particular, the mystery of the liturgy. Such initiation enables the faithful to develop something like an inner sense, an inner visuality, a new way of seeing that supplements and surpasses what the eye by itself is able to see and apprehend. In the Mystagogy, Maximus builds on the basic framework of the liturgy, stopping at salient points to highlight theological ideas relevant to particular parts of the service. His aim is to cultivate in his readers the appropriate state of mind that one needs to adopt in order to understand the liturgy's inner meaning and significance. In response to the separation of public worship and private prayer, Maximus constructs an elaborate synthesis combining the formal elements of the liturgy with the established practices of asceticism and spirituality. As we shall see over the course of my time here this evening, St. Maximus did this by identifying two things. One, the movement and progression of the liturgy with the stages of spiritual progress. And two, the structure and function of the church building with the structure and function of the human person. The result was that the ritual space of the church was mapped onto the interior of the space of the body, and the interior space of the body was mapped onto the ritual space of the church. And the reciprocity of these two spaces reflects St. Maximus's belief that the liturgy celebrated in the sacred space of the church is the visible manifestation of an invisible liturgy that takes place in the sacred interiority of the human soul. What we have then is something like a puzzle with several pieces, and so it will be helpful to look at each piece in turn and then consider the importance of bringing them together. Let's begin with Maximus's understanding of the liturgy. The liturgy that St. Maximus describes in the Mystagogy is not very different from the liturgy that is familiar to us today, and thus it unfolds as a series of interconnected parts or units. These include the petitions, the antiphons, the small entrance, the reading of the epistle and the gospel, the great entrance, the offering of the gifts, the consecration, the distribution of Holy Communion, and so on. Though Maximus comments on 12 such units, he understands that the liturgy itself is divided into two basic parts. The first part being the liturgy of the Word, which culminates in the reading of the gospel, and the second part being the liturgy of the faithful, which culminates in the consecration and distribution of the Eucharist. These are the two high points of the liturgy, which are two revelations of the Word of God, first in Scripture and then in the Eucharist. Consistent with earlier writers, Maximus understands the liturgy of the Word as symbolizing the coming of Christ into the world and his work of redemption. The liturgy of the Word, as I said a moment ago, concludes with the reading of the gospel. And with the liturgy of the faithful, the symbolism dramatically shifts from the historical life of Christ to the end of history and the last judgment. Maximus associates the reading of the gospel with the end of history based on Matthew 24:14. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. He further points out that after the reading of the gospel, the bishop descends from his throne and divides the congregation, dismissing the catechumens and ushering the faithful into the mystery of communion with Christ, an event which for Maximus foreshadows the separation of believers from non-believers at the Last Judgment. So while the Liturgy of the Word symbolizes the first coming of Christ into the world, the Liturgy of the Faithful symbolizes the second coming and the Last Judgment. Though these are clearly two different moments, Maximus emphasizes that they are part of a larger continuum of incarnation and deification. If the Liturgy of the Word represents the incarnation, then the Liturgy of the Faithful makes present the gift of deification that has been made available through the incarnation. This remarkable division of the liturgy finds a parallel in Maximus's responses to Thalassius, which was written around the same time as the Mystagogy. In this text, Maximus suggests that all of history is divided into two great periods of time. The first was the period when God became man, and the second is the period when man becomes God. The first is the time of incarnation, the second of deification. And here's the text. The end of the ages that were predetermined by God's purpose to become man has come upon us, because God has brought to completion his own perfect incarnation. We now await those other ages that are to come for the realization of the mystical and ineffable deification of human beings, in which God will show us the overflowing riches of his goodness, completely bringing about deification in those who are worthy. Let us then separate the ages in thought, setting aside some for the mystery of the divine incarnation and others for the grace of human deification. And we shall find that the former have already reached their proper end, while the latter have not yet arrived. To state the matter briefly, of these ages, the former belong to God's descent to man, while the latter belong to man's ascent to God. This is a wonderful example of how Maximus's larger understanding of creation and universal history becomes a frame for the liturgy, which is not simply a religious ceremony or a ritual, but a truly cosmic event. Now, as you can see from the trajectory here that Maximus has plotted, his understanding of the liturgy is animated by a strong sense of forward movement through the historical life of Christ and into the life beyond, into the eschaton, as we call it. A movement that he maps across the longitudinal space of the church. Now, this movement begins with the entrance of the hierarch and the people into the church. It continues through the nave with the petitions, antiphons, biblical readings, and gospel, after which it advances into the sanctuary, coming to rest at the altar table where St. Maximus says, we are made worthy of the visitation of God and are united with him. Now, here it's helpful to recall the extent to which ancient liturgies were highly mobile affairs, characterized by organized movement across the sweeping lengths of large basilicas. Let me quickly show you just a few images to illustrate. So on your left here is the old St. Peter's Basilica, which, for example, was over 700 feet long. I'm not a sports fan, but I think that's the length of 2 football fields. All right. Here, starting on your left, is the Basilica Church of San Sabina in Rome. In the middle is the Archiropitos in Thessaloniki. And on the far right, Santa Maria Maggiore, also in Rome, all of them built in the 5th century. Liturgical entrances are also well illustrated in Byzantine art, as in the Minologion of Basil II on the left, and the famous mosaic panels of Justinian and Theodora in the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna depict the entrances of the imperial couple into the church. And note that Theodora's gesture of offering mimics the offering made of the Magi, which are poised and postured as she is, and also holding these cups or bowls or dishes, which appear on the hem, as you can see, of her mantle. So the movement that Maximus describes is a progression that traverses the 3 performance spaces of the liturgy. The nave, the sanctuary, which today we commonly call the altar, but the word is sanctuary, and finally the altar table. As I mentioned a moment ago, Maximus identifies these three liturgical spaces with the three stages of spiritual progress. And it is this identification that allows him to merge liturgical worship with the spiritual life. Now, by the 7th century, the three stages of spiritual progress had become standard among Greek ascetic and spiritual writers. In their simplest form, the three stages correspond to practice, contemplation, and theology. In the Mystagogy, Maximus calls the first stage moral philosophy, ηθική philosophia, but it is more commonly known, even by him, as practical philosophy, praktiki philosophia, or simply by its adjective praktiki, which of course is the name of the famous work by Evagrius. Praktiki, or praktiki philosophia, is the first step of the spiritual life, and it consists in keeping the commandments set forth in the gospel. Keeping the commandments, in most cases, requires a degree of asceticism. It requires the rejection of vice and the acquisition of virtue, and it aims, praktiki now, aims to free the mind from its impassioned attachment to the world. Praktiki is thus a process of conversion, and as a movement from vice to virtue, it gives spiritual meaning to the act of physically entering a church building. And here's a quotation from St. Maximus. We enter the church, he says, through the door of repentance, by changing our lives for the better, and by choosing virtue rather than vice. This is how someone can truly be said to enter with Christ into the church, end quote. Having made progress in practical philosophy, one is able to embark on the second stage, which is movement from ascetic practice to contemplation, known among these writers as natural contemplation, physiki theoria. Now, with the mind having been purified through asceticism, the surface of creation begins to become transparent, and one no longer sees the world through the distorting lens of sinful passions and desires. Enlightened by the grace of the Holy Spirit, the mind gains a deeper insight into the nature of the world. It sees the presence of God in all things. It sees how all things are connected, both to each other and to God, because all things have come from God and all things are returning to God. Finally, the third and highest stage of spiritual progress is theology, which means union with God, which Maximus also calls theological mystagogy or mystical theology. Those who arrive at this stage are raised beyond the limits of created nature, and they attain a union with God that is beyond all sensory, cognitive, and rational apprehension, because they are now completely filled by the uncreated and deifying energy of God and become God by grace. With these ideas in mind, let's now look at the passage that's in question here, which is from chapter 4 of the Mystagogy. It's somewhat lengthy and dense, but I think it merits quotation in full. We'll start with just part of it. The church of God is like a human being, having the nave as its body, the sanctuary as its soul, and the divine altar as its mind. Through the body of its nave, the church sets forth moral philosophy. Through the soul of its sanctuary, the church spiritually explains natural contemplation. And through the mind of its divine altar, it enters upon mystical theology. And the quotation continues. Conversely, the human being is a mystical church. Through the nave of the body, a person cleanses by the virtues, the practical part of the soul, by actively keeping the commandments according to moral philosophy. Through the sanctuary of the soul, one brings as an offering, the word is proskomizonda, a very rich liturgical word, brings an offering to God through his reason, the principles of creation separated from matter according to natural contemplation. And through the altar of his mind, and this is a very difficult and complex passage, we struggled over it in the seminar, through the altar of his mind, he invokes by means of another silence, sonorous and diffusive, the silence richly hymned in the innermost sanctuaries of the unseen and unknowable resounding voice of the divinity. And as far as is possible for human beings, he becomes conversant with that voice according to mystical theology, and becomes like one rendered worthy of God's manifestation and marked by his shining glory. In this passage, the church has the form of a human being, and the human being has the form of a church. In this reciprocity between architecture and the body, the three performance areas of the church, the nave, the sanctuary, and the altar table, correspond respectively to the human body, the soul, and the mind. Moreover, the liturgical activities associated with these areas correspond to activities that are conducted inwardly within the space of human consciousness, which also has its own nave, sanctuary, and altar table. The nave of the body encompasses both the activity of the body and the activity of the human mind engaged in the practice of what St. Maximus calls moral philosophy, which is the keeping of the commandments. In the sanctuary of the soul, there is a shift toward a more cognitive level as one turns toward the activity of contemplation. Finally, through the altar of the mind, the human spirit enters the realm of mystical theology, which is unmediated union with God. It is worth noting that St. Maximus elsewhere maps these same three stages onto the three orders of the church's hierarchy. The one who anoints his mind for sacred contests and drives out from it impassioned thoughts possesses the character of a deacon. The one who illumines his mind with the knowledge of created beings and destroys false knowledge possesses the character of a presbyter. And the one who perfects his mind with the holy myrrh of knowledge of the venerable and holy Trinity possesses the character of a bishop. As this passage makes clear, it is not only the threefold structure of the church and the body that Maximus aligned with the three stages of spiritual progress, but also the three ministerial orders of the church, deacon, priest, and bishop. In this alignment, Maximus has effectively merged ascetic spirituality with ecclesiology, giving asceticism a liturgical foundation and deepening the experience of liturgy beyond mere external rites and rituals. This is a question that we will return to in just a moment. Now, as these passages suggest, the space of the ritualized body is neither static nor inert. For Maximus, space is always qualified by time and thus by movement. We have then not simply a poetics or theory of space, but a poetics of time, or rather of both together, as the ritualized body advances in time across the space of a visible and invisible church. In the Mystagogy, this, of course, is not strictly a liturgical movement in any narrow sense of the word. As we have seen, Maximus identifies movement through the three spaces of the church with the three classical stages of spiritual progress, which is the distinctive framework of the ascetic life. This means that the performance envisioned by the Mystagogy is not simply a liturgical performance, but it is an ascetic and contemplative performance as well. The Mystagogy then presents us with a synthesis in which liturgy is transplanted into spirituality, and which in turn is transplanted into liturgy, so that both, each one, liturgy and spirituality, each one is revitalized by its new context. Without liturgy, spirituality is in danger of devolving into spiritualism, while liturgy without prayer and asceticism would be empty ritual, ceremony without substance. It was the genius of Maximus the Confessor to recognize the danger of such a disassociation and integrate the inner movement of the spiritual life with the outward experience of the liturgy. Now, identifying liturgy and asceticism in this way does not eliminate or diminish their respective features or elements. To the contrary, liturgy is deepened through the experience of ascetic practice and contemplation, while the renewal and the illumination of the mind in asceticism, these things are revealed, the ascetic life, in other words, is revealed in itself, in its depth, to be a sacrament. We're still singing the Paschal canon, right? Katharthomen, tas esthesis ke opsometha, and the rest. Let us purify our senses, the Paschal canon tells us, and we will see in the unapproachable light of the resurrection Christ shining like lightning. Katharthomen, tas esthesis. That's the first step of praktiki. It's right there in one of the most beloved hymns of the entire ecclesiastical year. Now, combining the experience of liturgy with the three stages of spiritual progress also means that human beings have not only a priestly, but an ascetic vocation. Through practical philosophy and natural contemplation, the members of the church become, as it were, the priests of nature. Through the ascetic purification of consciousness, they discover the spiritual principles, the logi, as Maximus calls them, of creation. And in light of those principles, they cultivate the gifts of creation and return them as a gift to God through the celebration of the liturgy. Through asceticism, believers are gradually freed from their impassioned attachments to the material dimension of created things. Once freed from the tyranny of surface appearances, the mind sees God as the intelligible ground of creation, revealing the unseen dimension of human and non-human nature and the deeper significance of the church and its liturgy. The purpose of the priestly and ascetic life is to transfigure the sensible aspect of creation, revealing God as the one in whom everyone and all things are united. The human, priestly, and ascetic vocation aims to actualize the potentials of nature in harmony with nature and the purpose for which they were created. The paradigmatic expression of this process can be seen in the gifts that are brought to the altar at the Divine Liturgy. We do not place wheat and grapes on the altar, but rather bread and wine. That is, the gifts of creation transformed by human art and technology. And we return them to the Creator in that form, who responds to us by transforming them into the body and blood of Christ. This is not an isolated liturgical event, but rather a paradigm with far-reaching implications for all human activity. Transforming the gifts of creation, for example, would affirm and encourage human progress in the sciences on the basis of wisdom and reason. It would encourage and support the organization of the social world with greater justice and compassion. And it would inspire artists to discover the spiritual potentials of matter and express them in monumental art and architecture. Through their God-given talents, the architect and the iconographer, the stone cutter and the wood carver, they discern the mystical heart of creation. And with their artistic skill and insight, empower creation to join the magnificent cosmic chant of the liturgy. This can be clearly seen in the aesthetics of Orthodox iconography, which avoids three-dimensional sculpture in favor of two-dimensional painting and mosaics. The removal of the third dimension, like the reduction of a sphere to a circle, serves to abstract or distance the figure from the mass and the volume of physical corporeality, placing it on the continuum between matter and the spirit on a point somewhat closer to the spirit. The same aesthetic can be seen in Byzantine architecture, which uses non-load-bearing curtain walls, as they're called, to conceal massive building supports. Reinforcing, so in other words, the ceiling of the dome of Hagia Sophia here is not being supported on those walls you see on either side, which are just delicate piles of columns. The supports are behind those so-called curtain walls, so it creates the appearance of extraordinary lightness for this unbelievably enormous structure. And this structural design is reinforced through the interior surfaces, which are lush and reflective. Ceilings are covered with acres of gold mosaic. Walls and floors are covered with polychrome marble and inlays, so that the structural supports lose their appearance of mass and weight and vanish behind the reflective and patterned surfaces. So too, the deeply carved marble capitals of the columns, which look like the lightest of lace baskets, impossibly supporting tons of solid stone. This harmony of technology and design, this transformation of the material world by the Spirit, is perhaps most effectively seen in the use of light as a fundamental ingredient in the architecture of Hagia Sophia. The apparent weightlessness of the dome is an effect created by a ring of windows that pierce the base of the vault at the very place where it begins to rise and curve over the nave, forming a luminous crown that lifts the dome from the rest of the structure. The overall effect is the spiritualization of matter, so that the entire structure is an icon of the material world, alive and pulsating with divine energy. Through the performance of the liturgy and in the very edifice of the church building, the gifts of creation are transformed and given back to the Creator in a spirit of gratitude, following the paradigm of the Eucharist and the words of the offering, thine own of thine own. In other words, thine own gifts of thine own gifts, these we offer to you. To God's gift of love, humanity responds with its own gift, which God receives both in the hidden space of the sanctuary and in the hidden place of the heart. Conclusion. Maximus the Confessor's Mystagogy is a dense and complex work offering a fascinating interpretation of the divine liturgy, the symbolism of the church building, and the transformative liturgical experience of the faithful in their progress toward deification. Intended primarily for cultivated lay and monastic readers, the Mystagogy effectively joins liturgical theology with ascetic practice and contemplation, showing the profound relevance and indeed necessity of the one for the other. In the Mystagogy, the structure of the human person is associated with the church, and the structure of the church with the human person. I think I messed that up, but the sanctuary of whose soul is filled with light. So through this fusion of symbolic forms, Maximus the Confessor presents us with a new understanding of both the church and the human person. Liturgical life and experience embody a new humanity in a profound connection between Christian anthropology and Christian liturgy. As we have seen, St. Maximus understands the visible church as an outward representation of the invisible church of the heart. The physical church is the visible manifestation of an existential structure that exists in the soul. And without the structure of the church, one might never know the structure of the soul. But without inner experience, one would have no experiential knowledge of the truth of the church's nature and purpose. And this, what can we call it? Mutual interiority of the church and the human person is not a metaphor. It's not a psychological phenomenon, and it's not the product of an overly pious religious imagination. To the contrary, it expresses the deep existential content of the human person transformed by grace. St. Maximus's insight, according to which the structures of human consciousness are projected into the architecture of the church building, and the structures and sacraments of the church are projected into human consciousness, well, this constitutes nothing less than an ontological refashioning of human life and experience. We can, I think, properly call this the ecclesialization of the human person through a free, liturgical, and contemplative reception of the Spirit in such a way that the life of the church becomes the content of a person's thinking and acting, indeed the very content of one's body and soul. Many years ago, a Christian living under communism was interviewed on a Western European television program. And when she was asked if Christianity made her happy, she replied, "You're not a Christian so that you can be happy. You're not in the church to be happy, but to be alive." Thank you.